try it again. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you. Welcome back from an engaging 45 minutes of getting blisters on your fingers by passing out business cards. I'm Jeff Fletcher. I'm Principal Consultant with G.H. Fletcher Consulting and honored to be here today to be the moderator of our panel. And our panel has a very interesting title, I think. It is Adoption and Procurement Are the Times a Changin', or Are Adoption and Procurement Keeping Up? The short answer is yes, the times are changing, and no, procurement and adoption are really not keeping up in either policy or practice. Now, that's a harsh judgment because I think in some places it is happening, but in very small pockets. And people are trying to keep up with the needs of the districts and with people like you who have a desire to help people in the school districts. So two folks who are doing their best to track and keep policy and practices moving to fit the needs of school districts are two colleagues that I've known for at least a year. Rick Gay, who is formerly purchasing manager in the Office of Purchasing at Baltimore County, Maryland Schools, and who is now procurement officer with Houston Independent School District. Joining Rick and me is Tracy Ginsburg, who is executive director of TASBO, the Texas Association of School Business Officers. And before we get into a discussion, and I'm going to sit with them and we're going to have a little discussion amongst ourselves before we open it up to questions from you, but I want to frame things a little bit. And if we look primarily at instructional materials, because most of you are involved somehow in touching on that, one benchmark is 1987, a long time ago. But in 1987, Texas changed the law for textbooks to allow digital content. And then 1990, the Texas State Board of Education adopted the first ever in the country electronic instructional media systems, and it happened to be a little program called Windows on Science. And the first one, you would think it would not get much of a market share, but it actually got 1/3 of the market share in Texas for elementary science. But in the nearly 2 decades since then, we haven't had that much change in what's been purchased or how it's been purchased. Essentially, we've got one book per student per subject area per grade level. And we're back to, as Rob was talking about this morning with the Apollo 13, we're kind of in a round peg and a square hole right now. The last decade or so, we've seen a marked change in what school districts want. They want more digital, and they want more flexibility. This has been driven by a number of factors that, now this is a little truth in advertising, a shameless plug is coming. I wrote a report called The Shift Toward Digital, Forcing Factors, Benefits, and Barriers that'll be available in about 2 weeks through MDR. And among the forcing factors is the increasing availability of bandwidth and Wi-Fi and an increase in the E-rate of $1.5 billion to almost $4 billion a year now for E-rate for school districts. The FCC also has taken action to address the homework gap, and that's the lack of access of broadband at home, which is an enormous problem for many school districts, especially in the rural areas. And a bill also has been filed in Congress to address the homework gap, which I don't have much hope for that one. That was a joke because nothing is going on in Congress right now. I just thought I'd say that. There are a growing number of devices in schools, and there's a recent report that came out that showed that Chromebooks are gaining market share substantially. They've got an under $300 device, and those things are really moving into the market. Two other factors that are pushing the increased purchase of devices in schools. One of them is online assessments for Park and Smarter Balance, and those other assessments that are not Park and Smarter Balance are pushing online as well. 75% of the students that took those end-of-year assessments last year took them online. That's a big chunk. They were available to 75% of the students. Another thing that has happened is the phase-out of Windows XP. Over 50% of the devices that were available for online assessment a year and a half ago, were Windows XP. Because that support for that was phased out by Microsoft, school districts got a grip and said, we need to get additional devices and different devices. So if you added these forcing factors, some changes in policy and the changing use of instructional time, such as the move toward blended learning and more project-based learning, you've got a substantial shift now from print materials toward digital. And the desire for digital is reflected in findings from MDR's EdNet, most recent EdNet Insight survey, where 50% of the curriculum directors expected substantial print-to-digital conversion within 3 years. Now, that's curriculum directors expected that. These are not the technology people. And then if you think about the technology people themselves, 50% of them are expecting increases in their technology budgets as well. The policies at the state level are changing in some ways, where we used to have the adoption states created winners. That is, the State Board of Education reviewed materials that were sent to them, or their people did, and they picked winners and said, these are on the list, and if you aren't on the list, you can't be purchased by the instructional materials dollars in your state. About half of the states were adoption states. Now, 30 states have a definition of instructional materials. All of them encourage and allow digital content. Texas, Indiana, and Louisiana, most recently, have changed the role of the state in the textbook adoption process from selecting winners to more so advisory, where they'll still create a list, but school districts don't have to buy off that list. So that's a huge change in terms of flexibility, and what that means not only for school districts, but what it means for people in this room who are able then much more easily to get into the market and sell their products and services. These same states, as well as North Carolina and Georgia, have also increased flexibility by allowing the use of instructional materials funds to be used for the purchase of technology or professional development. Again, more flexibility, positive flexibility for many people in this room. Louisiana's language strongly encourages the use of digital content. Florida took a much more dramatic step when they said 50% of instructional materials funding must be spent on digital state-adopted materials starting this school year. And North Carolina has taken the ultimate step by saying that by 2017-18 school year, districts should purchase only digital instructional materials. Again, this flexibility will make a big difference for the school districts, and it's going to make a big difference for you. So let's now turn to Rick and Tracy with a few questions, and then we'll open it up to you in the audience. And Tracy, I'll turn to you first. Can you take a minute to talk about how districts are adapting to this additional flexibility in instructional materials, as well as the new changes in the budget?
As you referenced, the State Board, beginning with the 2013 biennium, we were no longer an adoption state. And it kind of happened overnight. We weren't really expecting it. At the time, I was serving as CFO of Fort Bend ISD, which is a large suburban district in the Houston area. And we weren't prepared. I was facilitating the group to talk about, okay, guys, reading ELA adoption, what are we going to adopt? We don't have to buy all the books that we've always bought, but yet we bought all the books we'd always bought. We did things just the way we always had. I was speaking with textbook coordinators over the past few weeks preparing for this, and getting that mindset of a team approach and looking to the future is somewhat difficult, somewhat new. We're used to, and what scares me as CFO is that I think this is the next great unfunded mandate. Because your digital content, written content, it's all very, very expensive, and there is a set sum of money. The way funding works in Texas, just real quickly, the State Board essentially has two responsibilities anymore, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they set the rate of return on the permanent school fund, and half of that rate goes into the school funding formula, and the other half goes into the textbooks formula and the instructional materials allotment. And they do establish the TEKs and review materials and approve materials for listing on the state site. That's essentially it. Well, this legislative session, school districts are realizing this is a cash flow issue. We're having trouble finding them, being able to afford the materials. that we need, as well as in technology, because prior to this, when in 2011, districts lost their technology funding. And so we kind of had a double whammy. And so the legislature, this legislative session, says this is a big year for Texas. This year was social studies and math and fine arts were our big adoptions and our change in TEKS. I don't know if you've been paying attention to Texas, but social studies is really out of cycle. It should have been adopted about 4 years ago, but we've been rewriting history. And so we finally got around to adopting our social studies text. And so the legislature said, you know what, we'll give you both years of your allotment. It's about $1 billion a year that goes to instructional materials in Texas. It's distributed among school districts and charter schools. We'll give that to you up front. Well, in the background, the piece that no one realized was, or didn't stop to think about, was, gee, how are we going to afford this? Because the state does not have the cash flow to upfront those monies. And without getting into a lot of logistics about state funding formulas and whatever, in Texas, every child is entitled to what's called a per capita allotment, an available school fund allotment. Even Chapter 41 districts, which are Robin Hood districts. Well, what happened is, to pay for this up front, the state lowered the available school fund allotment for districts. If they were Chapter 41, which more than half of the districts are, that impacted their operating budget. So in the case of Midland ISD that gets $4.8 million in IMA money over a 2-year period, he lost $3 million in his budget this year that will never come back. And so he's trying to balance the needs of the teachers and faculties to purchase these materials, while at the same time balance the needs of the budget.
Which probably creates a good deal of anxiety as well as resentment.
Absolutely.
Toward that whole thing.
Absolutely. And so, but school districts are beginning to get to the point where they are forming policies. Districts have kind of set limits for how much percent should be spent on instructional materials, how much can be spent on personnel, because you can pay for instructional support out of these dollars, and how much can be spent on devices. Typically, they're trying to, some districts have used the 65-35 formula, and I mean, it's a district level decision. So.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you need to understand is that in the educational environment, about 85% of the budget. So, when the school system says, like, I came from Baltimore County, our budget was $1.4 billion. And on the surface, that seems like that's a rather large budget. However, about 85% is for benefits, teacher salaries, those types of, it's a personnel thing. We're a service delivery industry. So really, my discretionary budget was somewhere between $200 million and $300 million, depending on what we were doing in any given year, and probably anywhere from 40 to 60% of that would be for renovation and construction and things like that. So if you're catching along what I'm saying here, the piece of the pie for curriculum and technology is getting smaller and smaller of what school systems have to buy your products. And when you look at the fact that the delivery system, so like for example, we initiated a very dynamic one-to-one initiative where every student over the next 4 years would have their own device, and every teacher would have their own device. So like for example, just to give you a couple of numbers, over the next 4 to 7 years, we're going to spend $200 million on devices alone, just to lease the devices. Then when you start talking about, well, you got to have the curriculum for that and the digitization of that curriculum, that gets even more expensive as you try and bring that in. And I think part of the problem is that a lot of the vendors, especially the publishers, have not caught up with what does digital curriculum mean. They think if they give you a CD-ROM of the textbook that's digital. They don't understand that what a lot of people in this student-centered learning process is, I only want pages 5 through 25 of Tom Sawyer. because I think that's where the main emphasis of the storyline is, and that's what I want to emphasize with the kids. So, we're having to meet up with all these requirements of how do we get the curriculum into these devices. It's extremely expensive. And oh, by the way, if anybody makes a mistake along the way, you're subject to talking to me on Wednesday, and if I make a mistake, you're talking to someone new on Friday. Okay, because these are expensive decisions, and the public wants to know that we're being good stewards of the tax dollars. So we're going to make we're not going to make these decisions in a vacuum. We're not going to make them lightly. And so I had instituted a process in Baltimore County where all the vendors would come through me. We would do the initial vetting of the vendors, and then I would become a facilitator. And I realize not every procurement person you talk to is like me, so that's okay. But I would facilitate then who they needed to see and who they needed to get in front of so that they weren't running around 600 square miles of Baltimore County trying to make a sale. Because I really didn't want that, because we had very stringent rules about what we could spend and what we couldn't spend. In Texas, it's over $50,000. In Maryland, it was $25,000. Before you had to have a solicitation or you had to have some kind of process in place. And my curriculum people would talk to you and they would come in and say, oh, but their sole source letter here. Okay, right. As a procurement professional, I hate sole source because it's such a high standard to try and meet, because you have competitors. If I went around this room and asked who's the competitor for you or you or you, 3 or 4 people would step up and say, oh, well, we have a similar product or we have a like product. So the procurement laws are such that they haven't caught up with all this new technology and all this new stuff. The copyright laws were written back in the 1800s. And so when you tell McGraw-Hill, I only want pages 5 through 25, they're blowing in a brown paper bag. They can't deal with it. So, we have to come up with new legislation, new ideas, new ways of getting this thing, and still protecting and being good stewards of the taxpayer dollars so that they understand that they're getting the right bang for their buck.
So, Rick, you mentioned in particular the desire for more chunks, and yet licensing, copyright, all those things seem to argue against that. But it's what school districts sound like they want more and more. Are you seeing any changes in subscription models, either one of you, and not just subscription models, any changes in purchasing models or business models that would play more toward this desire for more flexibility?
I really think that that's the key answer there, is how flexible can you be in your business model and in your delivery methods of your product. I get a lot of vendors that come in and say, well, but I'm only $2 per student, or I'm only $4 per student. I have 215,000 students. Think about what that is for me. On an annual basis, that's a huge chunk of money that I'm going to have to set aside every year then in the budget process to pay for that product, if it's just the subscription. So we've got to look at other ways. I remember having a conversation with the Apple people, and they were trying to get into the textbook arena, and they were talking to McGraw-Hill and Pearson. They said, well, we're going to use a model like what you use right now with your iPad. We're only going to charge you $9.99 for an Algebra 1 book, and you can download it on the iPad. The only problem was they were looking at it as an individual buy, not as a school system buy. And I quickly understood, wait a minute, you want me to spend $9.99 per child per year for Algebra 1, where I was used to going out and spending $10 million for Algebra 1 and using that book for 10 or 15 years. And so I said, you guys got to go back to the drawing board and come up with a different model, because the amount of resources available to school systems is not infinite, it's finite. So how do we cut up this piece of the pie and make it all work for everybody so that we're getting what we need on the devices that we have in the infrastructure that we have to build? When we started the one-to-one program, we found out very quickly we didn't even have the infrastructure to support the delivery of digital curriculum and everything. We had to go out and spend another $15 million just on Wi-Fi access throughout the county. And so all of this stuff just cascades down, and from my perspective, we all say, well, when is enough enough? Tracy?
Oh, I think we're seeing a change. I also think that you can't just keep your focus on the school district, you have to keep your focus on the home as well. A perfect example is the science adoption. Fort Bend tried to do just all digital with a classroom set of textbooks because, quite frankly, it was more economical, and we really didn't want to use the textbooks because even though that $10 million serves you well, things change, and digital is so much better. But as you were talking about Florida, I thought to myself, what happened to us is parents wanted a book and demanded a book. And so somehow or another, we have to help. And I tell my CFO counterparts all the time, we have to get the public into our schools because they remember school like when they were at school. And, I remember Mrs. Swift in 3rd grade sitting on her stool reading us a story. Well, she would be asked to change her instructional model today. And we all sat and listened. Kids wouldn't listen today. So it's a different ballgame these teachers are dealing with. And it starts out in the community.
Well, it's interesting. The same thing happened when Optical Data had Windows on Science adopted. The parents were screaming. They want my kids want to bring stuff home. I want to see what they're doing. So they scrambled and they created workbook-like things that had some of the same content that was already on the things that the teachers were using in class, which were video discs, and they sent those home primarily to ease the parents' minds that indeed our kids are learning, our kids do have materials, and it does make sense. So it's interesting that we're still there.
And even if you go digital, your administrators and your faculty may not be on board with that digital concept. As we were rolling out digital curriculum, we were also monitoring how many copies were being made on each campus and the cost per copy page and all the things that go with that. And we were seeing schools that were racking up hundreds of thousands of copies. And I called this one school because they constantly were breaking down their machine. I said, what are y'all doing out there? You're almost 1 million copies this school year. And they go, oh, well, we're taking the digital curriculum and copying it and putting it in 3-ring binders so the teachers can use the curriculum.
Every child had I think we were using 3 cases of paper per child when I started monitoring it.
We in Baltimore County, it was 54,000 cases of paper, which was like 380 million sheets of paper. And I even had a good price. And so it was like $1.3 million just for paper being spent just to copy. And I said, you do know that the curriculum is changing almost on a daily basis, right? And she goes, oh, yeah. And I said, so that means you're copying the curriculum almost every day or every other day, right? And she goes, yeah. I said, okay,
Well, it sounds like job one for all of us is implementation of digital content is certainly more than just saying, here it's available, click here and you get it. But not helping teachers understand how to teach with that content is a real problem. Which leads me to another question. Are y'all seeing, one of the things that I've read and heard in talking with school districts is that more and more they want things bundled together and not just instructional materials. They also want professional development bundled with that. They want service and support bundled with that. Are you seeing that desire from your school districts?
Yeah. In fact, when we have a successful adoption process, and we're in the contracting phase with the vendor, I have 3 sections that I divide my contracts into. I have the subscription side, or the actual purchase of the software or of the product. I have the maintenance side. How's this thing going to be maintained, and who's going to be responsible for that? And then I also have the PD side, and that's an additional cost that really gets baked into the process, or needs to be baked into the process, but it's something that everybody in my line of work doesn't always have a good understanding of what that cost is, or what that is. And because a lot of your curriculum people are always going to say, oh, well, we need PD, and we want We want web-based, we want teacher-based, we want internet-based, whatever it is. And everybody sits there and says, okay, well, we can do that, but here's how much it's going to cost, which causes a large gulp in the room, when everybody looks at that price tag, because by and large, most educators don't have any concept of what cost is from a business standpoint. So we've got to get our arms wrapped around that and come up with, I think, business models or methodologies for making that palatable to the school systems.
Tracy, any thoughts from your experience?
Certainly, I think that makes sense. PD dollars and PD staff in particular have been reduced dramatically just because of budgetary constraints, so all the help you can give us would be great. But the real issue comes with time and the school calendar, and if I could wave a magic wand, I would change the school calendar. I do not know why we think 187 days is enough and that's it. But just finding time on that PD calendar. So what happens, I'm afraid, is that we don't do it justice. And that's one reason why sometimes it's not as successful as it needs to be.
Well, I think that the need is enormous for the professional development out there, especially, of course, with a Common Core and or other higher standards.
Oh, yeah, higher.
Bowing down to Texas, or different standards in Texas. So that change, the kind of change that we're seeing in how students are learning and how teachers need to be teaching to accommodate to how the students need to learn, all of that needs some help. And you pile on top of that some new instructional materials, and there's this enormous opportunity, it seems to me, for folks to look at all that as a piece, rather than as separate and distinct ones. But we also have the problem in school districts and states, and correct me if I'm wrong, where in many cases PD dollars are over here, curriculum dollars are here, and there's no mixing of that. Title I dollars are over here, and there's no mixing of that. So there seems to be a need to break down some of those silos as well in terms of the money.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So what's the one thing that you would like to see happen with the whole purchasing and adoption process to be more in tune with what your folks need?
I just think you need a process. I mean, a lot of school systems don't have a process. And I think that it's very hard for us then on the procurement side to defend the procurement decision or the choice of the product. My worst nightmare as a procurement professional is to be sitting in front of my Board of Ed testifying and supporting my curriculum people's decision to buy this piece of software, saying that this is the best choice for our school system, and have a vendor stand up in the back of the room and go, excuse me, but nobody ever asked me about mine, or nobody ever asked, talked to me. And, so then, the board is on you and everything. Well, how did this happen? Because people still think that this is a competition and that you have to look at everybody, and everybody needs to get a fair chance and everything. So I think you have to have a process. A lot of school systems don't. Fortunately for us at BCPS and now at HISD, I have a process, and that I can go to the books and I can look up this process, and I can ask my curriculum people, did you follow the process as you selected this product? And then give me your justification. Where did you evaluate it? How did you evaluate it? What were the results? What were student results? What were teacher results? How did we know that this really is going to work in our schools and things like that? And I think that would be the one change. I think that if I could, I would change curriculum not to be tied like it is buying, commodities. Like I do when I go out and I buy when I buy food for food service, or I go out and buy diesel fuel for buses, or I buy electricity. I don't think curriculum needs to be tied in the same type of law. So I think we need new laws and new ways of selecting curriculum, selecting software for the classroom, so that we can get it to the classroom a lot faster. Oftentimes, by the time we go through a process, that thing's been bypassed by technology, and there's something else coming down the pipe. So, I think we need to get a lot quicker in our decision-making process.
Tracy?
Well, this new change with the state board not being Texas not being an adoption state has made the State Board of Education a little antsy. They feel like they don't have any power, or I don't know, power's not the right word, but they feel like they're less valued. And so they're not on board at the moment, to be perfectly honest. If I were going to change anything in Texas, I was surprised at the lack of approved digital content on the commissioner's list. Because what happens is, if you're on the commissioner's list, you don't have to upfront the money. The state will handle that out of your allotment. If you're not on the commissioner's list, you have to go through an application process and a justification to explain why you want to buy Windows on Science or whatever it is, and have some delay while it works its way through TA, which is a bureaucracy like a school district in all reality. And so often what happens, I think some things are probably being missed that are valuable instructional resources. So this is a new thing in Texas. So my hope would be that we would begin to look at all products and do some vetting at the statewide level. Because if I'm at a large district like a Houston or Fort Bend, I'm going to do another layer of procurement. But if I'm out at Wink Loving, I'm going to look to the state to give me the best tools, or go to my regional service center. And so personally, I wish there was more guidance from the state, and I think there will be in the coming years.
You want that guidance to come from the state board?
Not particularly.
Okay, I'm with you.
There's some good people at TEA.
I did a little digging within Texas, and one of the things that was interesting, the shift that has occurred in terms of not being an adoption state has been pretty substantial, and that the number of the amount of money spent on instructional materials adopted from the adopted State Board of Education list was about $275 million. This is 2014. Then the instructional materials not on the State Board of Education list was $304 million. Now, those, and correct me if I'm wrong, but those things not on the State Board approved list could be the same materials that are on the State Board list, but at a different price. Or they could be different chunks of content that y'all sell. It could be things that are just in the same market. It could be history, but not on the approved list, but somebody else is selling history. But what's interesting to me was that difference that we have now, where less dollars, fewer dollars are spent off of the State Board of Education list, and more dollars are spent off of the list.
But some of that's probably for equipment and personnel, or is that in another line item?
Some of that's in a different line item.
Okay.
Only $10 million was spent on technology services in that, and and $17 million on technology equipment. So it's an interesting shift there. So one last question for these folks, then we want to open it up to you and make sure you have plenty of time to ask the questions that you want to ask. And that has to do with who is involved in the purchasing process for instructional materials. Rick, you talked about you had a process. Who are the kinds of folks? I mean, because I think these people would be really interested. Who do I need to talk to in the process?
Well, it depends on the size of the school system. A lot of the people out in the audience probably really prefer the smaller school systems because they're actually, in most cases, probably talking to the teacher in the classroom, and they're able to sell the teacher in the classroom on the value of their product. As you get up in size and you begin to encounter the professional procurement staff, you're going to run into somebody like me, who's going to sit there and say, okay, well, tell me about your product. What does it do? Where you've been successful? These kinds of things. But what I'm going to do is try and push you back then to the curriculum side of the house, because we're starting to come back with, the site-based decision making. That's all well and good. But, when you're talking about millions of dollars and everything, you've got to have some kind of centralized decision making. Otherwise, you're going to be all over the map, and different schools are going to have different software, and then you're talking about support and all the other things, and where's your contract and this kind of. So by getting our arms wrapped around this process a little bit, we can kind of do things the right way. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to get to go talk to the person that you need to talk to. And so I think as you get in, what I'd like to see is come to me first, then I'm going to facilitate your meeting with other curriculum people and everything and let them make the decision as to whether they think it's a good product or not, or whether they think you have value. And then I'm going to sit there and say, okay, well then show me the process that you went through to make your final decision, so that we can say that it was properly vetted, that we followed somewhat a procurement rule or a procurement process in trying to make our decision about this thing.
Tracy, in Fort Bend or other places?
Well, back before I came to Fort Bend, I was at Round Rock ISD, and we had a very defined process for program evaluation, and we involved the curriculum team and audit team and finance team. And I tried to model that when I arrived in Fort Bend, particularly with the change in the adoption process. And so certainly you need your key leaders from all the special areas at the table. So that includes special ed, because whatever you adopt, special ed is going to be a part of that. That includes Title I and different instructional areas, depending on what's in the adoption cycle. And I think where districts sometimes become short-sighted is they just look at this year's adoption cycle. Well, they need to be, the adoption cycles through 2022 are already out there, and they need to be looking down the road, because that was my mantra, if you will. Okay, if we spend all the money now, what are we going to do when science is up next year? Because we don't know the cost of that. We don't know the needs of that. And so we try to involve everyone at the table and have a discussion. But at the end of the day, Texas has some pretty specific rules, and I'd encourage you, if you want to do business in Texas, the State Board is going to hear some proposed changes in November, so it's out on TEA's website. So I would go out and read the proposed changes to Chapter 66 of the Commissioner's Code. Teachers have to ultimately be involved, and there's some very specific limits to how involved you can be at that level. And I think that's one of the most difficult things about this process, and something that we've got to get over the hurdle is we may come up with what we think is the greatest solution, and we can't afford it. So it's finding that balance. That's why everyone has to be at the table. Everyone has to feel a part of the decision. But at the end of the day, it comes down to what are the district's resources, how much can they supplement that instructional materials allotment, because it won't cover the needs of the district, the needs of the students.
So with that, let's open it up to questions. There's a microphone over here and a microphone over here. Looks like Steve Rappaport is taking over Frank Catalano's role as asking the first question. Steve?
Hello?
Yeah.
Open education resources haven't really figured so far in the conversation. I have a two-part question. First, have open education resources figured in your acquisition strategies at all? But what I'm really more interested in is having to do with business models around OER. On the software side, some companies have made a very successful business model out of wrapping services around software, Moodle Rooms, for example, being a noteworthy example. I know I've had conversations with some publishers in our industry who think there might be a way of wrapping services around open education resources as a business model. Do you think that would work?
Yeah, it would just depend on what the pricing models, would come back at, on those things, because at the end of the day, every decision we make is budget driven. And so, whatever way that they can get the material to us, if it's going to streamline the process, if it's going to create, economy of scale and cut the pricing down to a point where you have a chance to get it in there, then I would say, yeah, that would be a way to go.
And this year, fine arts is on the adoption list right behind social studies and math. And our fine arts leaders are having to go to the open market. The difficulty with open resources, in my mind, is you still have to teach each of the TEKs. And you still have to guarantee to TEA and ultimately to the state board that you've addressed the TEKS with the curriculum you select. And I wouldn't want to be the first school district to adopt the open resources because I would, the minute scores dipped, it'd be my contract that would be on the line. So,
Steve, I think it's a really good question because OER is as you indicated, is moving up in awareness substantially, and I think more and more products are out there and more people are interested in it, primarily because they're free, and unfortunately, to my way of thinking, that's not the highest value of OER. The highest value of OER is being able to personalize that content. But the business model around that is, I think, still very much up in the air. Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Many vendors in this room and across the world, the country, use a pilot as a first step of gaining sort of access to a new market. And so the question really is, if you could comment on how that vendor can then go from the pilot, which hopefully is successful, to then an ultimate adoption or contract without it tripping a competitive RFP in which perhaps they may be no longer eligible to qualify for.
Yeah, I think that's where we come full circle to. There has to be some changes in the procurement laws where either there's an exemption or a different process for curriculum materials or to include technology and digital type materials versus how we go about buying commodities and goods. And I think that part of the problem is that companies will come in, they'll sell the idea of a pilot to the powers that be within the school district. They'll do the pilot, and then and pilots aren't cheap. We've had discussions with vendors. They're anywhere from $25,000 to $250,000, depending on how much they go in and how much material they put in and how they structure everything. And you're going to go back then at the end of a 3 or 6 month period and say, well, boss, we spent $250,000, but we didn't get the contract. Because now they got to do an RFP and somebody else beat us out on the RFP. That's just not conducive to what they're trying to accomplish here. So I think there has to be other ways to do pilots or other ways to get the analysis of platforms out there. I've heard some unique things just today about how some schools are starting to work with universities. Universities are piloting it, testing it with kids, coming up with the data and the research and everything, giving it back to the company so that they can actually go out and say, here's where we've driven that, because everybody wants to know how well does the product perform and everything with kids. And then you conversely hear the thing of, well, I'm HISD. I really don't care that your product worked in Poughkeepsie. Okay? So I want to know how it worked with a large school system with my kind of demographics, with my kind of kids. And that's a tough sell.
Tracy, thoughts on pilots?
I really hated pilots, to be perfectly honest, because of that exact issue. So I would try to do an RFP and a scaled RFP from the front end, which I know is not necessarily the most efficient way, but for that very reason.
Thanks.
Yes.
Mike Baum, Sophia Consulting. Question somewhat similar to Steve Rappaport's, but maybe a little broader. Jeff, you had asked a question earlier about bundling. I'm going to ask a question about unbundling. For several years, we've been hearing that schools and districts are going more and more to wanting to put things together, not accepting a curriculum as such, even from an established publisher, let alone OER, but choosing pieces from this source, pieces from that source, and integrating them all together. In fact, a couple of years ago at a panel like this, I heard a superintendent from somewhere in Texas, if I'm not mistaken, saying we just won't take a curriculum from a publisher. They've got to break it up. How much of that is actually reality? Your response to Steve's question kind of indicated maybe not so much.
In Baltimore, we were starting to unbundle, or as you say, or break up curriculum quite a bit, because we had built a large platform, student learning management platform. We had built we had a large student database warehouse that had been tracking kids for the last 15 years. And so, we were able to get in there and slice and dice this information and look at this kind of stuff. So we knew what was going to work and what wasn't going to work. So we were very heavily into talking to various vendors about well, we only want a piece of this and we only want a piece of that, and then trying to merge them together into a dynamic curriculum that our teachers were working on and helping to write and helping to present to other teachers and other people in other school systems. So when people come to me and say it's free, I always know there's nothing free. There's always got to be some kind of pricing model involved somewhere, and so otherwise you wouldn't be in business. So I get it about the open sourcing of things and everything, but I really I think there has to be some kind of business model that goes with it too.
I think that unbundling is becoming more the norm, and maybe not to the level it needs to be, but primary, secondary, and some of those levels, where perhaps districts are running into issues. And I was talking to a superintendent this week. He wanted to unbundle his curriculum, and his instructional materials coordinator was saying he didn't want any part of that because that doubles their work, if you will. And he was saying that was more expensive. And it's truthfully, the instructional materials coordinator is going to change in the next 10 years. It won't be that the same person it is today. I mean, I was fortunate in Fort Bend to have the brightest guy that I had ever worked with, but a lot of districts, that kind of becomes the place where you go if you're, you know what I mean? And that I do know is changing, and I do know superintendents in particular are seeing the value of buying pieces and parts, and it's totally available to them.
Well, then a couple of things to that. Rick mentioned the notion of content repositories, and more school districts are creating their own repositories. Half of the states have content repositories right now, where they're just taking in content that whether it's OER or other licensed content, and then they're providing that out to their school districts. And of those 25 that don't have content repositories now, about half of the others are thinking about and or building content repositories. So that notion really lends itself more and more to unbundling and chunking of content, and people, because there's a broader array of folks who want to get into that content. So I think it's another piece to watch in the whole instructional materials area is who's got content repositories, how are they being used, how much are they being used as well. You had a question?
Yes. I'm so short. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm Rachel McCoy with MDR, and I have a question around professional development. Tracy, you had alluded, obviously there's a lot of focus on PD for instructional materials, integration of technology. And my question is kind of two-pronged. How does that impact more of professional development as educators, whether it's leadership, it's school culture, it's involving the community and understanding about the changes that are happening? With respect to funding, is there funding, or is all of the PD funding really focused on instructional materials and technology, the integration of that? And then secondly, what about the delivery? What kind of shifts do you see in the interest? Is it webinars? Is it bringing somebody on site, having people go off site, train the trainer? So just curious about, is that PD and the focus on the curriculum resources and technology sort of taking away from other PD as professionals?
And I think that depends on the district and the district's vision. Typically, districts have anywhere from 8 to 10 PD days a year that are required, and typically those are very scripted. And much of it is curriculum focused, but certainly there is leadership focus. Unfortunately, there's a day or a half day PD on how to fill out all the forms and do all the requirements. I mean, let's face it, we're in a paperless age, but we create more paper than any profession I know, I swear. But campus PD typically focuses on those student relationships and on those leadership things, like tribes and those type, love and logic, and some of those PDs that get to those relationships with the students. Many districts are going to kind of an innovative schedule, and actually the state this last legislative session, we're going to minutes. So students have to have so many instructional minutes in the future as opposed to days, which scares me because I don't know how we're going to keep up with a million minutes or whatever it is. But
somebody saw dollar signs out here, though, said, "Oh man, I can create a system for that."
I know, please, because I'm used to attendance at 10 o'clock, and I think the world's going to change. But some schools let pick a day a month or a day a week, even depending on that profile of that school, where they let out early and they do that professional development during that time. They also use that time to work in what I see more and more is teachers planning together and looking at students together rather than being in the isolation of their room, which I think is the first thing that's necessary for a school to be successful.
Yeah, we in Baltimore County, we had specific days in the calendar that were listed for PD. And unfortunately, we were a collective bargaining state, so that was all union driven as to how many days. And then it added to the cost because the union would say, well, you're going to pay us, right? And everything. And professional development, I think, is something that's ongoing almost 24/7. You know, teachers are sitting, I've been married to a teacher for 38 years, and she sits at the couch with me watching the ball game, and she's sitting there on her computer, you know, looking at websites and looking at lesson plans and grading papers and doing things. So, you know, this thing is an ongoing kind of thing, and I think that there has to be a change in how we view professional development. Tracy made a very good point. That planning period that is yours by contract right and everything has to take place in a place where all the teachers from a grade group are together and they're talking about, well, here's how I'm teaching this, here's how I'm teaching that. And what about, you know, after school, and what about other opportunities for teachers to get together? And we've got to break out of the set mindset of that you only get so many days a year to do this. Professional development, for especially in the digital age, has to be continuous and almost every day kind of mentality. Otherwise, you're never really going to make that, I think, that jump over into the new world.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. My name is Horacio Cho. I'm with Blooms. And so in the recent past, we've seen states more interested in parental engagement as a tool to increase students' performance. And my question is two-pronged, and I'll give just a little context. My company, we created a platform for communication between teachers and parents, so we try to save teachers time by having all the tools to communicate with parents in one place. So my question is, first, have you seen the same interest in your districts on parental engagement? But also, the second part is, will they budget for it? And will, you know, if there will be budget for that, where is that going to come from? Is it, you know, obviously would it be from a tech perspective, a tech budget? Will they even add budget for it?
Well, truthfully, parental engagement is part of the new accountability system for school districts, so I'm assuming they will, because it will affect how they're rated on our state accountability system. I know that there are teachers, I mean, I have two teachers at home, and they are both using different tools out there to communicate with parents that are kind of available over the web. But this is last year was the first year that districts had to quantify. And I think as that becomes more refined, I would see that there would be a need for a product.
Yeah, our teachers are using, you know, their own classroom web pages, their own, you know, their own ways of, you know, mediating or meeting up with parents and getting the information out on homework assignments, on assessments, on performance, not only as a group, but by child. You know, I'm communicating with the parents of that child. But, you know, you can only do so much, and if the parents aren't engaging in some communities, like in your urban areas and everything, it's very difficult to get some parents engaged in what's going on in the classroom or even in the school. You have your most engagement from what I call the two outlying groups, your gifted and talented people and your special ed people. Those tend to be the most vocal groups that show up at board meetings, that come there and let everybody know what they think about the curriculum or how they think about teachers are reaching out and things. And this large swath of kids in the middle, you really don't hear much of anything about. So any kind of product that helps engage parents in what's going on in the schoolhouse and everything can only be beneficial.
But I would caution you, 60% of the students, well, 61 or 62 at this point in Texas, are economically disadvantaged today. There are a large number of them that are at homes that don't have computer connection. And so I would caution you to think of a way to be able to reach those students. And those are the parents that we need engaged most of all. So if I were going to create the perfect product, I would figure out something in that arena. I mean, it kills me. I went to Costa Rica last year and everybody had a cell phone. They didn't have any windows or doors on their houses, but they had cell phone with better reception than me. So something's going on that they, and we have to figure out how to get that connectivity at the home.
Please join me in thanking our panel, terrific panel.